I'm Jim English. I direct the Penn Humanities Forum. I want to thank everyone, first of all, for making it over here to the museum on what's really not a very nice afternoon. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. We have Paul Cobb here, the chair of that department, and my thanks to him. Also co-sponsoring tonight and working with us on a number of events through the year is the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women, directed by Nancy Hirschman, who also is here, and we're very grateful to her and her colleagues at the Alice Paul Center for their guidance and support in putting together this series on sex. The mastermind of this year's series is Heather Love. Heather is the R. Jean Brownlee Associate Professor of English. Through her published work, her very busy calendar of speaking engagements, her visiting appointments at other universities, she's had a worldwide influence on scholarship in her fields of queer studies, gender politics, methods of literary study. Here at Penn, she's had an equally commanding influence. She's renowned as a brilliant teacher. She's a very generous colleague, and she's a leader of the LGBT community. She's going to introduce Afsaneh Najmabadi, so please welcome Heather Love.
Welcome, everybody. This is our second event and the first academic lecture in the Penn Humanities Forum Year of Sex. And I can't think of a better person to launch the academic portion of our public series than Afsaneh Najmabadi, Professor of History and Chair of the Committee on Degrees and Studies in Women's Gender and Sexuality at Harvard. Afsaneh Najmabadi is a scholar doing some of the most important and groundbreaking work on questions of sex, gender, and sexuality today. And she will be remembered by some of you for her brilliant and moving talk on research ethics at the Queer Methods Conference held at Penn in 2013. So we're very happy to welcome her back to Penn tonight. So when I teach courses in gender and sexuality studies, the burden of explanation is on me to explain to students that sex is not a natural or obvious phenomenon. The most powerful way to make this case is by explaining that sexual norms and sexual behaviors, even what counts as sex, varies considerably across time and space. Professor Najmabadi's work is exemplary in opening up the seemingly transparent categories of sex, gender, and sexuality by situating them historically and demonstrating their entanglement with questions of power, nation, religion, race, and modernization. Najmabadi marshals these historical complexities to address pressing questions of gender and sexual politics in the present. In her 2005 book, Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, Gender and Sexual Anxiety in Iranian Modernity, Professor Najmabadi investigates the ways that the making of Iranian modernity depended on gendered categories. She further argues that those categories like man and woman, emerged in the process of modernization. Moreover, that they emerged alongside, in her words, quote, sexual desires and practices rendered illegible and unreadable by the national culture. More recently, her 2014 book, Professing Selves, Transsexuality and Same-Sex Desire in Contemporary Iran, takes up the relation between gender and sexuality in contemporary Iran. Najmabadi addresses the phenomenon of legal transsexual surgery, noting the global media response to it, which has suggested the Iranian state is forcing transition as a way to correct homosexuality. Najmabadi conducted an ethnography to see how the availability of transsexual surgery is affecting the definition and experience of gender and sexuality. Drawing on legal discourse, psychology and psychiatry, Islamic jurisprudence, and biomedicine, Najmabadi reads the contemporary situation in Iran in relation to its long history of modernization. Furthermore, she attends to everyday practices of getting by, finding that people are more constrained and more strategic in their decisions than more distant analyses tend to suggest. It's just an incredible piece of scholarship, one that I think highlights Najmabadi's self-reflexive and careful treatment of a set of difficult issues. Now, this is just 2 books, and it really doesn't begin to capture the full range of Najmabadi's accomplishments and interests. She's published and edited more books than I can name here, and is at work on large-scale projects, for instance, the Encyclopedia of Women and Islamic Culture in 6 volumes. Najmabadi's career is also capacious. She holds a BA and a master's in physics and a PhD in sociology. And the fact that she's now a distinguished historian who's just completed an ethnography gives you some sense of her range. I can also say from personal experience that Afsaneh Najmabadi is a wonderfully generous, insightful, and humble mentor and colleague, someone whose integrity infuses her scholarship as well as her teaching and mentorship. So I'm really happy to welcome her to give this lecture, The Kin Who Count and Those in the Shadows. Please welcome Afsaneh Najmabadi.
I hope you don't expect me to live up to that biography, and I hope you won't be too disappointed. I do want to thank Jim English and Heather Love for asking me to come to this, to give this talk. And as much as I pushed back and said, I'm not working on anything to do with sex, they kept saying, no, come. So first warning, this talk doesn't have that much to do with sex, as you will see, but we'll see. I also want to thank Sarah Vorney, who did all the arrangements and stuff, so thank you for bringing me. I'm especially grateful because this is, as I explained before to both Heather and Jim, is a very new project. I've barely thought about it for a year, and this is the first public presentation of any of it. As we say in Persian, it's totally uncooked. It's a whole bunch of ingredients right now in a pot that hopefully something with some flavor will come out of it. So I'm depending on you to start helping me to spice it up and give it flavor and make it cook. So with that, let me begin. And since I have a tendency to go on a lot of tangents, I'm going to try to stay with the text. Around the current conversations in the US on marriage and the campaign I'm just seeing where I put my hot water because I have a sore throat. And thank you. So, no, this is fine. Thank you. Around the campaign to open the legal institution, once presumably between one man and one woman to two men and two women, several other questions have come to surface. For instance, how did marriage become evidently an affiliation between two individuals alone in the first place? How did marital home become the privileged space of socially approved sex? And circling back, how did movements for redefining spaces of socially approved sex become movements for marriage equality? My talk is, of course, not about American history of marriage and family, but I start with this note because I think reminding ourselves of the historical contingency of these developments is never too redundant. As I learned from a first-year college student recently, in her progressive high school social studies discussions on same-sex marriage, the comparative foil has been arranged marriages, of all places, in Iran. Undiscussed were historicity of love marriage, even here in the United States, of the conjugal couple as the meaning of family, and of marriage as a relation between two persons. And that despite the legal bond being between two persons, quite frequently, marriages continue to be family affairs. Moreover, I want to keep in focus through my work on Iran, but hoping for broader consideration, the question of unintended consequences, and more specifically, the emotional costs of pressuring for legality of one type of relationship at the expense of other familial and kin practices. The kin who count in the title of my talk comes from an Arab proverb via the title of Margaret Berry-Weather's 1999 book on Ottoman Aleppo. As she elaborates, and I quote, it says, loosely paraphrased, the kin who count are the kin who show up on the day of the battle. As this proverb, this is she talking, as this proverb suggests, the strongest ties and most meaningful relationships within the family exist among people, among those relatives who show up, who are there for you when the going gets tough, drawn by a sense of responsibility or mutual obligation and or feelings of affection that can exist independently of the formal structure of family ties, namely patrilineage, household inheritance rights, marriage bonds. End of her quote. Across the region, now divided into many nation states, but in the 19th century, variously part of the Ottoman domain and Qajar Iran, even with vastly different engagements with colonial powers over that period, Russia, France, and England, the idea of who counts as kin, and more specifically, what constitutes or ideally ought to constitute the family, changed dramatically over a relatively short time. Initially, for a segment of the cultural elite of social and political reformers, but rapidly for a much larger layer of the population. Changes in family law in the 20th century were more varied from country to country and continue to unfold to this day. Practices of everyday life, as far as who counts as kin and what family means, remain even more complex and least studied. On the level of ideas, two critical changes were first, as Kenneth Kuno in his recent book has persuasively demonstrated for Egypt, the ideal family became conjugal family. And second, as most scholars of the Middle East have shown, the ideal marriage became a companionate marriage based on love rather than arranged by parents, and preferably monogamous rather than polygynous. My current project, however, focuses on a third level. What happened to everyday practices of the familial within the near imperial hegemony, to borrow Pavanelli's term, of these two ideas, of the companionate monogamous marriage and the conjugal couple as family? How did men and women live their lives differently? Take one example. Polygyny was outright banned in Turkey in 1927, I believe, but remains legal, though restricted to various degrees, in Egypt and Iran. But remains in Iran, among other countries in the area. Yet in all three, polygyny continues to be practiced to this day. How do we understand these practices of everyday life, despite differing legal realities? How did expectations of women in particular about marriage, including sexual pleasures thereof, change once companionship and love became the primary signs of the modern marriage? How did who count as kin change? What kind of relations began to fall out of the familial orbit and into its penumbra? For example, two women's vows of sisterhood, or two men's intimate friendship that made them brothers. What has become of these voluntary kinship formations and practices? I will begin with a personal vignette. I had looked at this photo many times in recent years. It had the rare, helpful date on the back. In my aunt's Efat's penciled handwriting, 21st of March, Iranian New Year, 1937. Remembering the 1st of Farvardin, 1316, with the whole family. I know there are a few Persian readers there. It says, ba tamam khanevade, with the whole family. And in her brother Nosratullah's ink notation, to my loving sister. These distinctions in color, writing utensil used, and in handwriting already tell a sub-story. Nosratullah Efat's youngest brother committed suicide sometime in 1937-38. The notation in Efat's handwriting, with its distinct difference on the back of this and several other photos, inclusive of Nosratullah, he is in this picture, repeating the phrase, with the whole family, seemed to have been added by her after his death as a way of remembering his living presence in these photographs. Despite the familiarity of this photograph, when I looked at it again in late summer of 2014, something struck me as strange. The verso notation with the whole family refers to a large group of complexly related people, including some of the siblings and half-siblings of my mother's, the first on the left. Even stranger, the two older women, second and third from the left, were my grandmother and her late husband's other wife. At this time, spring of 1937, sharing a residence with all their unmarried children in Hassanabad neighborhood of Tehran. I looked at it resistantly, a bit painfully. I could not imagine a photograph of myself with my older sister and my younger half-sister, whom I did not know existed until spring 1987. I was then over 40 years of age and did not meet for another 20 years until 2007. Even less unfathomable would be my mother and my father's second wife, framed in one photograph. Such photographs did not exist. Even imagining their possible existence felt rather bizarre. Unlike my mother's whole family, we did not share everyday life. How did such photographs become impossible to imagine? Within a single generation, over the early decades of the 20th century, concepts and practices of marriage and family life changed rapidly and dramatically. These rapid changes also generated the wide usage, perhaps coinage, of familial vocabulary. For instance, when I use a word such as half-sibling, it stands for its current Persian equivalent, natani, literally meaning not of the same body. My mother never referred to her half-siblings as such, a linguistic pattern that turned out to be common to all the families I discuss in my writing. Indeed, some objected to its use. In many, mothers were called mother regardless of whether one was the biological mother or not, as reported in many published memoirs written by members of the large Farman-Farma household. This picture from the memoirs of Mehmah Farman-Farmayan, its title Under the Father's Gaze, is captured Our Mothers, and has three of them. In Qajar period documents, in particular legal ones, such as inheritance divisions, wills, if a clarification was necessary, it would be explicitly added as such, batni, meaning from the same womb, stomach, or solbi, siblings who shared only father, and the not belonging, as in the expression natani, would not be noted. My mother's mother, Alaviye Khanum, the second from the left, and Madame John, the third person from the left, my grandfather's other wife, with all their many unmarried children, for many years after their husband's death, lived in the same residence. The residential pattern of complex urban households varied, of course, significantly across class lines, even within one city neighborhood and within different parts of one's married span of life. For my purposes today, what I want to note, however, is that all the men and women in these family photographs, I too called aunt and uncle, with no halves or other modifiers. Indeed, I was closer to one of my, so to speak, half-aunts than to some of my full aunts. Yet the first time when my half-sister's son called me an aunt, it was a very strange sensation, a resistant affect towards embracing that assignation that ran through me. How have these different patterns of affect and sentiment come to be within one short generation? Not only did my sister and I not grow up in a combined household with my father's second wife and daughter, we had no idea a second family existed till after his death in autumn 1986. Neither did my mother know anything about a second wife. How had changes in the idea of the family and the practices of marriage and family life transformed what was her growing up experience into an unspeakable secret? Indeed, how had the imperial ideational hegemony of love marriage generated modes of not knowing on my mother's part, and indeed on my part as well? What I mean is this: once we learned of the second family, my mother and myself thought and rethought numerous events that could have been signals for knowing. It is not simply the benefit of hindsight accorded these events their now different meaning. It is, of course, that too. But so much knowledge, including familial knowledge, is generated not through language. What everyone knows without anyone having said so in language. Our not knowing, I suggest, points to circuits of knowledge, knowledge production and information transfer, signs of recognition that have broken down within families, and their shadows, their penumbras over the same period, as the ideational sovereignty of love has consolidated. That sovereignty has generated family unspeakables, at times secrets, at times commonly known, but unspoken knowns. It has as well generated the will not to know, occluding the meaning of familiar habits and practices. I want to offer one example through the Tunisian film some of you may have seen and be familiar with, The Silences of the Palace, a 1994 film directed by Mufida Talatli. Set in the early 1960s, during the immediate years of struggles and eventually removed French protectorate over the country in Tunis in 1956, the life story of the central character, Alia, is narrated through a series of flashbacks. The film begins with her as an adult woman singer, possibly in the late 1960s, when upon hearing the news of the death of Said Ali, one of the sons of the patriarch within whose large household Alia had lived with her mother, Khadija, a domestic servant until her mother's death from an abortion. Within the filmic text, Alia asks several times who her father was. No one, including her mother, ever utters an answer. Yet the viewer, within a very short time, the first few minutes of the film, comes to share the knowledge of her unspoken paternity with all the characters in the film, Said Ali. Said Ali and his brother, also living in the same residential complex with his wife and children, upstairs, so to speak, actually literally upstairs, have sexual liaisons with women of the downstairs of the household, some depicted explicitly as violently forced. Others through possible material or emotional favors. Khadija's relationship with Said Ali is depicted of the latter kind. His emotional favoritism is shown to also extend to Alia. In a graphic scene, witnessed by Alia, Khadija, her mother, is as well raped by Said Ali's brother, resulting in the pregnancy that ends with her death. Alia and Sarah, the daughter of Said Ali's brother from his wife, are born on the same night. And the viewers, in fact, get one of their first knowledge pointers about who Alia's father is from Said Ali's anxiously pacing in the yard when Khadija was in labor. Alia and Sarah grow up together and live virtually inseparable lives, though Sarah's is clearly a privileged one, privileges of a home-tutored education, music learning, fancy clothes, etc., none shared by Alia. Possibly as the result of bearing Said Ali a child, his own wife is said to be infertile, Khadija retains a privileged place in Said Ali's life. Everyone in the household, and soon the viewers, know this. Yet no one ever speaks it. In an earlier historical moment, in less Europeanized households of Ottoman patriarchs, whether in mainland, so to speak, Anatolia, or in other Ottoman domains, including present-day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, the men and women who were depicted as domestic servants in this film would very often would have been openly bought slaves. The sexual access of men of upstairs to the women, and at times the young men of downstairs, would be taken as a granted service of the slaves. Female slaves did bear children, and that could, but not necessarily, result in their becoming manumitted and one of the judicially recognized wives, though of lesser social status. Their children became part of the children of the household with the same inheritance rights, etc. Over the 19th century, several Ottoman edicts made the slave trade illegal, but domestic servants that were often brought by families to families in childhood, at times by their parents, and lived their entire lives there in service, continued for decades well into the 20th century, as depicted in this Tunisian film. Male members of the patriarch's family continued to practice their father's generation of sexual access to domestics of the household, but with emergence of the conjugal couple as the modern ideal familial setup, these relations became unspeakable in the open. The children no longer recognized as part of the patriarch's familial group. Kenneth Kuna indeed opens his book by noting how Khedive Ismail, the Ottoman viceroy of Egypt between December 31st, 1830 until his death in March 1879, had multiple wives and concubines. However, his grandson, Halim Helmi Pasha, who ruled between 1892 and 1914, practiced polygyny surreptitiously, like a man with a mistress in a legally monogamous society, even though polygyny remained legal in Egypt to this day. That's a quote from Yuna's book. Similarly, in the silences of the palace, Said Ali and Khadija's sustained relationship is unspeakable. It is one of the many silences portrayed and performed powerfully in this film. Alia, the child of this relationship, with whom Said Ali displays an affectionate relationship, is incessantly included and excluded from who constitute his family. This ambivalent inclusion is performed in a remarkable sequence of a family photograph, which I'm going to show very soon, I promise. Before I play this sequence, however, I need to mention the coincidence of these changes in familial concepts and practices of everyday life with the arrival of photography to the Middle East. Photography came to some of the urban centers of the Ottoman Empire and to Qajar, Iran, shortly after its invention in Europe. Both the camera as an object and the family photographs were among those objects of everyday life that generated changes in practices and meanings thereof of everyday life. As Alan Dubin and Jem Bahar have argued in their marvelous book, the entry of European objects of daily use, such as ordinary knives and forks, furnishing, etc., into Ottoman homes, bringing with them new manners of doing things, distanced people from the ways their parents did things, setting in motion a complex symbolic act laden with various layers of meaning. Often, social histories discuss at length seemingly more important grand changes under the rubric of modernity, modernization, the modern individuated self, etc., but tend to ignore the very ordinary processes through which changes in concepts and practices of everyday life take shape. It is as a result of the ordinariness of these changes that achieving modernity is never smooth, nor evenly or homogeneously spread, modernity is never fully achieved. As Latour famously put it, we've never been modern. Because of the ordinary ways in which, for instance, people begin to use individual eating utensils on individual plates in place of using one's finger and eating from a common platter, and because even people who have for several generations eaten with knives and forks still continue to eat at times from a common platter and with their fingers, the very ordinariness of shaping a modern individual through these life habits continue to regenerate totally unmodern, or better yet, in Svetlana Bohem's expression, off-modern practices as well. Two of such ordinary objects of everyday life that are related to the present discussion of changing meaning of families are, first, the white bridal wedding gown and the dark formal suit of the groom, replacing local, colorful, and often fancily embroidered clothes brides and grooms used to wear at wedding celebrations. And second, family photographs in general, and more specifically, taking a photograph of the bride and groom in these novel outfits. Bride and groom studio photographs were not necessarily taken on the wedding day. This was its own ceremonial occasion that became part and parcel of performing conjugality of the new family. Malek Alule, in his book, The Colonial Harem, in a chapter called Couple, discusses the couple as a misreading of the European camera, an aberration, a historical error, and an unthinkable possibility in Algerian society, his quote. Yet by the 1930s, the couple picture had become nativized performance of marriages in many Middle Eastern countries, including Egypt, Iran, Turkey, itself an indication of conjugalization of family ideal. One meaning that this change of wedding clothes, along with the related photograph, marked was that the bride and groom were a different couple from their parents. Specifically, the white wedding gown of the bride and the tuxedo of the groom now sharply mark the conjugal couple, sartorially distinct from the rest of their families within the scene of marital celebration. Previously, brides and grooms wore fancier clothes, but generally not clothes uniquely marked as wedding clothes, nor as necessarily and uniquely distinct from those of the guests. I have two examples from an archive of fabricated. One of them is this photograph, which is a 1921 photograph that's of the couple. Well, you're seeing it there, the two people there with one of their relatives in there. And the next one is actually from 1942, and it's a studio photograph of, well, that's actually my mother and father. But there are plenty of these. If you're interested, now here's a side track advertisement. Go to the Women's Worlds in Qajar, Iran, and there's plenty of both kinds of photographs to see. The wedding photograph, a picture of bride and groom alone, often taken in a studio, emerges from the early 1930s. Going to the professional studio, dressed up and staging conjugal coupledom in front of the photographic lens became part of the marriage ceremony, as Kuno has argued, and I quote, regardless of whether they lived in a joint or conjugal family household, couples who posed for intimate photos presented themselves as bourgeois conjugal families, end of quote. These photographs, framing the couple in their distinct clothes, not only reflected the process of idealization of the conjugal couple, they in turn contributed to its power incessantly. These photographs were framed and displayed in the home in prominent places, on walls, on cupboards, bookshelves, over pianos in more prosperous homes. Their ubiquitous visual presence, one saw them every day, one saw them in most urban middle-class homes, generated its normative idealness. But the conjugal photograph was not the only scene of familiality. taking occasional family photographs, often at particular celebratory occasions when the whole family got together, as the Iranian New Year picture I opened this talk with, would produce other photographic performances of familiality, not always just the nucleated core, especially in households that continued to live as generationally combined ones, in some cities well into the middle decades of the 20th century, before increasing urban population and changing residential patterns dramatically strengthened nuclearization of the family. Although, as several urban ethnographers have shown, at times smaller familial units would move into the same apartment block, each occupying one floor, thus preserving in vertical architectural layout its multi-generational, horizontally connected character. Family photographs and albums thus became important cultural objects, one of the technologies that generated who counted as kin. Different inclusions and exclusions continue to this day, indicating that practices, despite the ideational power of the concept of the conjugal couple, are varied in important ways. From the photographs on family I worked with, the Mallah Waziri family, several indicate a purposeful, insistent inclusion of children from different wives, at times using collage. I think I have one of them here. Yeah, this is a collage made. This is sort of the couple in the middle, but it includes this woman who's a daughter of his from an earlier marriage, and this woman who's also a daughter of his from a later marriage. Even though the wives were no longer alive, but one of the daughters of the couple, who's a very old woman in her 90s, and I had the privilege of interviewing her at long length, she had actually stuck these together to give the creation of the family and inclusion of these other people in the family. I'll discuss this family a bit later because it's actually quite an interesting combination of marriages and the unmarriages, so to speak. Now, after this long detour, I want to go back to the story of Alia and her mother, and who's cut out of the process of taking a family portrait in the garden. Possibly this family portrait taking is, again, one of these annual rituals.
سارة يجي شوفيس عم نستناو فيك. نوريك وحنا نستناو فيك.
Toi, éloigne-toi, tu vas être sur la photo. Attention, ne bougeons plus. Voilà, merci.
Alia, Asia.
So as you see, Alia runs with Sarah into the picture frame, but she's waved out, ordered to move out of the frame by the photographer, indicating he's familiar with who the family is, but he's probably also prompted by Alia's flower pattern dress. She's not properly dressed in white as the rest of the family is. She's dressed like the people on the right, the downstairs people. She moves away and joins her family group. The downstairs people presumably also will be photographed. They all look dressed up for the occasion. The frame is at once what will be the encadre photograph and what defines the borders of the patriarch's familial group, the exchange of looks between Said Ali and his wife, between Alia and Sarah's brother before she moves away, between Alia and her mother and the other domestic servants to the side of the main frame. They all tell a story that no one would say in words. Then Said Ali takes a photograph with the two girls, born on the same day, one recognized as part of the family, the other not. Here again, without uttering a word, he makes Alia belong to him. Alia considered herself as belonging to him, as being family to him. There are many scenes of affectionate touches and looks between the two. Later in the film, we will see, if you haven't seen this film, I highly recommend it. We will see that she keeps a copy of this picture, that one there, in a special box hidden under other objects. In a remarkable scene towards the end of the film, she uses a pair of scissors to cut him off. Well, actually to cut herself out of that picture, showing her deep anger and disappointment when he utterly fails to protect her and her mother, when he fails to be there for them. She will cut him off, or she will cut herself out of that kin group. Iran's social practices were, of course, not identical with the Ottoman patterns. For example, a more common practice than sexual liaisons with female slaves or concubines was the practice of temporary marriage permitted in Shia Islam, in which a man, aside from permissibility of more than one permanent wife, up to 4, could contract numerous temporary wives, that is, through a limited time marriage contract that lapsed automatically unless renewed. Men in many families whose life narratives have become part of the larger story I hope to write exercise this prerogative, at times with the encouragement of and even arrangement by their permanent wife. Yet in both the Ottoman domains and Qajar Iran, the cultural transformation of the idea of the family was virtually the same. The taken for granted possibility in a woman's life of one's husband taking another wife, though in actuality statistically improbable except for a small percentage of the population, yet most often feared and resented, became a desired and expected impossibility. This made it even more painful to acknowledge when it did happen and became known. Many of the memoirs of Middle Eastern women who had lived in these transformative decades narrates their full knowledge of their husband's sexual liaisons outside their presumably monogamous conjugal bond. This knowledge was part of my mother's knowing, which she had passed to me even before we learned of my father's second marriage. But what had become variously inconceivable and generally experienced as intolerable was the husband's marrying one of these other women. Turkish writer Halide Edip, who lived from 1884 to 1964, for instance, explains in her memoirs the reason for her insistence on a divorce from her first husband in 1910, long before polygyny was outlawed in Turkey, in precisely such terms. Though not yet illegal for Edip, polygyny had already become unbearable. She had grown up in an at times polygynous family, but she had opted for a love marriage, she explains, and had expected otherwise. My aim in this larger project is not to attempt to answer why these changes happened, nor even how they came about, but more narrowly, if you will, how within a short 2 or 3 decades, the ideas of love-based monogamous marriage and of a nucleated conjugal household acquired a near hegemonic ideational power. And perhaps even more puzzlingly, how despite their persistent failure and despite continued heterogeneous practices of familial everyday life, they continue to the present day to hold such an ideational power. Further, I hope to map how persons living these transformative decades might have experienced affectively the changes in everyday life practices. In attempting to understand the overwhelming ideational power of romantic monogamous marriage, I found Pavanelli's proposition of co-emergence of evil ideas against which the good idea gains and sustains its power very persuasive. She asks, how then do these discourses deepen their grip on social life, though they are internally unstable and referentially untrue? She suggests that in the context of her study, the maintenance of such sovereignty depended on constituting 3 kinds of truth about the subjects and objects of empire: the truth of intimacy's proper domain, the truth of its normative ideals, and the truth of the contrasting evils that surround it. In particular, I want to suggest that the power of the concept of love-based, always linked with monogamous marriage, and of a nucleated conjugal household depended and continues to depend on the co-emergent, self-evident evilness of arranged, usually presumed forced marriage, of polygyny, and of generationally expansive families. Whereas in the Ottoman domains, polygyny was often configured in relation to concubinage, in Iran, part of the foil against which monogamy developed its hegemonic ideational power was, as mentioned earlier, temporary marriages. The romantic companionate marriage was to be monogamous and permanent. As numerous scholars writing about similar developments from late 19th century to 20th centuries in Ottoman Turkey and Egypt have noted, polygyny was statistically insignificant, nor do we have any evidence-based study to demonstrate that arranged marriages were necessarily or largely forced, nor that most households were indeed multi-generational over much of one's life cycle. Following Pavanelli, therefore, I suggest that these ideas' long, stubborn life as evidently evil, despite truth on referentiality, has intimately depended on the life of their co-emergent good. Their lives have mutually regenerated and sustained each other. Who could be against love? Who could advocate forced marriage? The argument that the power of concept of romantic monogamous marriage and of nucleated conjugal household depends on the co-emergent self-evident evilness of arranged marriage, of polygyny, and of generationally expansive family risks its reversal. Am I nostalgic for polygyny, arranged marriages, to put it most bluntly? This powerful reversal contributes to constituting the self-evidence of the goodness of the first set of ideas, as if always we have no other way out of the 2 historically co-emergent terms. To borrow from Svetlana Bohem's discussion of nostalgia as taboo, invoking nostalgia as a warning is meant to protect us against a fearful faith. And I quote, "The predicament of Lot's life, a fear that looking back might paralyze you forever, turning you into a pillar of salt, a pitiful monument to your own grief." Even more critically, historians are often worried about how nostalgia interferes with their work. For example, Hegnar Wattenpap has argued that nostalgia can displace the crafting of history or historical investigation. In this sense, nostalgia, she argues, interferes with and prevents a critical recollective approach to the past. It preempts and prevents a critical engagement with the past, among other things, and encourages a regressive retreat into comforting memories of an imaginary past. But introducing a sharp delineation between nostalgia and history is itself a particular approach to doing history, which sees the task of historian as explaining what actually happened without taking into account what could have happened but did not, and how the meaning of what did happen in part depends on other possibilities not happening. Considering nostalgia as a mode of memory would bring it back into the process of crafting history rather than as impediment to it. Again, to quote Boyam, the nostalgia considered in this sense is not for the ancien regime, but for the unrealized dreams of the past and vision of the future that became obsolete for unrealized possibilities, unpredictable turns, and crossroads. Boyam proposes incorporation of nostalgia in what she calls an off-modern fashion to make us explore sideshows, back alleys, rather than the straight road of progress. It allows us to take a detour from the deterministic narrative of 20th century history. In other words, bringing nostalgia back into historical imagination may help us imagine affinities that existed, could have continued to exist, but no longer exist. It may help convey a sense of sentiments and affects associated with particular memories of events, at times through visual effects of photographs, of feelings of space, in the case of residential buildings and changing neighborhoods, etc. It may also help us appreciate the complex practices of familial habits of life, because despite the 20th century ideational near hegemony of romantic marriages and nucleated families, people have continued to live vastly complex familial lives. This complexity is as well linked with different state projects of modernizing family legislations. Unlike Turkey, for instance, polygyny was never forbidden by the civil codes enacted in the 1930s in Iran. Not even by the later Family Protection Act of the late 1960s and early 1970s, which made additional permanent wives conditional on the consent of previous wife or wives. Nor has the prerogative of men's taking numerous temporary wives been ever challenged. Despite its legality, the practice of marrying more than one woman, and even more so temporary marriages, became shameful, at times scandalous, and a sign of backwardness, something to be kept in the shadows, if not completely a secret. The scandalous shame of taking a second wife continues to shape current family tales in private and in public, and in the process marks the narrator's own stake to claims of modernity, as in the case of public shaming by feminists of polygynous male public figures, and at times of women who continue to live in such marriages. In Turkey, on the other hand, the 1926 adoption of the Swiss Civil Code made polygyny strictly illegal. Religious marriages without civil registration were also made a criminal offense. Nevertheless, as Afsaneh Najmabadi, among other scholars, has argued, unofficial local religious practices, including multiple wives, have survived despite all the attempts of the state. Indeed, official statistical surveys and censuses indicate that both in rural and urban centers, a percentage of marriages continue to be registered only as religious marriages. Yilmaz gives the figure for 1990s of 7% of marriages in rural areas and 3% of marriages in urban centers registered only under religious law. Indeed, he argues that polygamy remains socially acceptable in certain situations, such as infertility of the first wife or her failure to beget a son. What is important to note here is that precisely because such marriages are illegal, the practice depends not on its unknowability to the community, its social and familiar secretiveness, as it is largely the case in Iran, but to the contrary, on its being known, of its protective acceptability, even if largely in limited circumstances, by the larger community. Community knowledge and at times protection becomes necessary in the face of illegality. This is not to deny the gender differentiated effects of these practices, as numerous scholars in Turkey have documented. In many cases, both first wives as well as religiously sanctioned additional wives face various hardships. The latter's children in particular have to acquire legal identity papers with the first wife listed as their mother. But note that this practice itself requires the collaboration of even local civil servants in not knowing something illegal has occurred when a woman gives birth to children less than 9 months apart. Both in Iran and in Turkey, second wives at times face particular disadvantages. In Turkey, the legal non-recognition of their marriage puts them at times in particularly vulnerable positions, such as in cases of domestic violence, financial abandonment, etc. In Iran, the necessity of keeping the second marriage a social secret rather than a secret from the state, and keeping the same family in the shadows, generate both financial and emotional hardships. My family's story that I just mentioned a little bit of is not an anomaly. In addition to my own complex familial relationships in the larger project, I turned to life narratives of other families with whose lives I became deeply enmeshed, initially through texts and eventually through many conversations with descendant generations. My acquaintance with one family I have already mentioned, the Mallah Waziri family, has its roots in editing for publication an 1894 manuscript, Vices of Men, by Bibi Khanum Afsaneh and of the memoirs of her daughter, Khadija Khanum, as prepared from taped interviews by one of her daughters, Mehrangiz Mallah. As I collected information about Bibi Khanum, it turned out that in addition to a temporary wife her husband had taken, which she actually discusses in Vices of Men, as one of the examples of Vices of Men, there had been a second temporary marriage from whom a daughter, Maryam, was born. But when I began to correspond with one of Bibi Khanum's granddaughters, she was surprised that I knew Maryam existed. Mentioning her name in front of other family members at times created hesitant silences and exchange of glances. Eventually, I learned that this second temporary marriage had been facilitated by Bibi Khanum herself, sometime around 1911. In 1906, Bibi Khanum had established one of the first new schools for girls at her own home. Her husband, Musa Khan, had been away on a government assignment and had taken their 4 adult sons with him. When they returned with adult males around, it became untenable to continue to use the house as a girls' school. Bibi Khanum set up her husband and her school in 2 separate houses. She had wanted to be relieved of any spousal duties, as another granddaughter, Mahdaba Mallah, recalled, and arranged for a wife, Maryam's mother, for her husband. The episode is noted only cryptically in Khadija Khanum's memoir, ending the section in which she discusses the new house school arrangement with, I quote, "My mother had grown old, she was tired, there were family problems, every family has its particular internal problems," end of quote. When giving account of her siblings, Khadija Khanum mentions only her 5 full brothers and 1 full sister. Neither Maryam nor her unnamed mother, nobody in the family knows her name, appear in these unpublished memoirs. On the other hand, other family members told me that Maryam was a dear part of the family and that they all called her Aunt Mary, Khale Mari. What difference does it make? One family member told me in a scolding tone when I first inquired about her place, Maryam's place, among the big tribe. And we already saw the collage titled The Mallah Family, which included 2 children from other wives of Mr. Mallah. Several other family Amanda family photographs similarly included the whole family. As in the case of my own family story, different accounts of complex familial relationship emerged and changed as I had a chance to meet more family members and hear their stories, and sometimes told and retold in various settings. In addition, through the working on the development of a digital archive project, Women's Worlds in Qajar, Iran, not only were large numbers of documents made available that began in my mind to map out what everyday life in late Qajar, Iran may have looked like, how it may have been lived, how it became recorded through documents, photographs, and to borrow Nancy Miller's words, what they saved. But the process of collecting these collections also took me and other project members into families' living spaces, where we heard family stories told. Some of the life vignettes that have informed the propositions of this talk emerged out of becoming, over the years, part of these other family stories. Every family I had broached this subject with over the past few years in several cities in Iran and among Iranians abroad have told me stories that indicate this change in certain familial practices of life, going from ordinary, though not emotionally neutral, to secretive, unspoken, and unspeakable, was all but a nationally shared experience of at least urban middle-class familial life from the early to middle decades of the 20th century. The stakes for achieving modernity of marriage included spousal choice, status of polygyny, the pattern of joint households in which the whole family lived, its breakup in later years, and the move to more nucleated, though by no means nuclear, families. Some of the sociological patterns of these changes have been studied by other scholars. What I hope to bring out are the patterns of expectations, emotional investments, and the affective disappointments in what were the promises of modernity for marriage, particularly for women. What were the effects of the breakdown of the information management, as Deborah Cohen has called in her book, Family Secrets, Shame and Privacy in Modern Britain, when unspeakables have to be spoken, silences have to be broken, and secrets have to come out? How do the ensuing pain, sense of betrayal and disillusionment with the promise of monogamy, for instance, become displayed? How do strangers, now relatives, begin to relate and become relatives? What did it mean, practically but emotionally as well, to be the marginal characters in family stories? How did particular relationships have come to be margins to create the center for nucleated monogamous marriages? I'm ending on these questions, and I look forward to your comments.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the sort of anecdotal approach you took with. So I really like the anecdotal approach you took in your talk because it raised a bunch of questions about my own family in it. And so my first question was how about wedding portraits and how more conservative families dealt with their wedding portraits, especially women who, for their wedding, would have their hair done and would have gender-separated weddings, but still go to the studio or the atelier and have their photos taken with their husbands, but weren't able to frame it on the wall. Did it have the same sort of ubiquitous value or not? And then second, I wondered how distance affected the Nautani and the Bautani family. And this is a question directly about my own family because as Iranians who live in diaspora, the only other family we have are my cousins who are from my grandfather's second wife, or actually first wife. We were the second wife children. So my grandfather had 2 wives, and in Esfahan, the families don't really have a relationship. But my dad's in America, and then my cousins in America, and then my third cousin from this family is in America, and those are really our tightest relatives. But when we go to Esfahan, we don't really see the rest of them because in Esfahan, they're far away. Yeah, sure. You can interview my dad. He'd love it. But here, and the thing is, they're so much older than, because they're from the first wife. So my cousin, I actually grew up calling him out. And to me, he was really my uncle. And when he passed away, that was a far bigger shock to me than when my own aunts, my own ammes, died in Iran. And so I wondered how changed some of this. Because it wasn't taboo for us to be friends, but in Islam, it is a little weird. So those are.
Well, I mean, it's a marvelous story you're giving. It's exactly the kind of thing I want to bring out. The really complicated patterns that nobody that I've talked to lived anything that looks like what it was supposed to look like. Everybody's life is very different. And I feel like, what kind of histories are we writing when we write things that are unreal? And people live their lives completely differently from the histories we tell. So I'm trying to do that by actually writing a lot of complicated family stories. And yes, everything you've said is very important. As people probably know, this whole notion of modern secular family, religious family, it's a big fiction. Within the same family, there are different practices. As far as the photographs concerned, the ones I know closely from observant families, the photographs that I see they display on walls and on top of frames are generally women in them are wearing a scarf. Wedding families and unscarfed women, they're in photo albums, and the photo albums are only selectively shown to closest people. But even these are changing. So I think basically the spaces of enacting conjugality of those wedding pictures changed compared to what we have now. Although now, because a lot of these weddings, even for most observant families, is happening in public spaces like clubs and like that, the style of the bridal dress has changed to be observant of the rules. So now they can display, and they do display wedding photographs for everybody to see the bride. The issue of the space is important. Although I really don't know the answer, like living in a city like Isfahan versus some of your family later on, and how reaching out to relatives in diaspora, how that has changed. That's why I want to interview you. Like in Iran itself, one of the things that I guess totally surprised me about my own father is that he had these two families within Iran. And the second family obviously knew the first family existed because they were second family. All the legal documents had my name and our name in like his certificate, Shanasname and stuff like that. But the first family knew nothing. But not only that, the whole complex of the neighborhood in which he lived, where we lived, and all the friends and the social life I knew him to be part of was completely unknown, mostly unknown to the second family. He basically kept these two, he basically lived two separate lives, and that's the only way he could sustain something that could not become speakable until after he died, and the second family contacted my family. But this is the way, and what I want to bring out, and that's why I like to talk to people who live in these complicated things, is I started by largely trying to reach out to my half sister, which I discovered so late, to know what the affective and emotional structure of her life was. I wanted to know, since my father's second family was unknown, he wasn't practicing what traditionally was practiced, to be with one family one night and be in the other house one night. He was at home every night, unless when he was on government assignments in other cities. So I asked her one day, how often did you see our father? And he said, well, 2 or 3 times a week. He would spend 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon at our place, and that was So I asked her how this meant effectively for her, and her answer was obvious. This was the only shape of family she knew. So it wasn't like she lost something. This is how she grew up. But there were moments of deep pain for her. For instance, sometimes when my father in the afternoon went to visit her and her mother would take her out for a walk in Taj Beach, his own mother, who lived with us, would be in the car because she liked to get out of the house and she would go out and would sit in the car because presumably he didn't tell her of the second family because she would have let the whole city know. Presumably, because he did have a second job, so presumably he sort of told her that this is part of the second job. He was doing landscaping for a new housing project. And she said, one of these days when we were walking, her father showed the grandmother sitting in the car. And that's the only time she saw her grandmother and from a distance. And she wanted to go to her, and my father was able to go to her. So these are the kind of things, what does it feel to know you have a grandmother and be forbidden to even go close to her? These are the things I want to bring out because it's all too easy for us to think, monogamy is better, love marriage is better, but there's a whole lot of emotional and affective costs for people who become the shadow relationships, who are the kin who don't count, basically. So yeah, it's complicated, and that's what I want to do, bring out the complications.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating talk, and I was really excited to listen to it because I feel like in my own research, I've done work with, I started out working with an AIDS NGO, and so it was under the banner of working with sex workers in Morocco. But they, of course, don't call themselves sex workers. They call themselves girls who go out. In other words, girls who leave the house. So it's juxtaposed between girls who are in the house and girls who are out of the house. And so I was really interested in this concept of unspeakable, and these people who become unspeakable, because from my vantage point, these are very much the sort of shadow relations. These women very much understand themselves from, I'm still analyzing my interviews, but seem to really understand themselves as trying to a household, but yet being in the shadows and constantly being sort of thwarted in their efforts to not having their other people, not their fictive kin, their kin, not recognizing their duties towards these women, again, who are supposedly in the shadows. But yet I wouldn't call them unspeakable because they are very much discussed, but perhaps the terms that are used to discuss them have shifted. So whereas they might have been called something else in an earlier time, now they're called prostitutes. And in the orbit of AIDS NGOs, they're called sex workers. So they're very much still speakable, just not within the context of the household. They become invisible from certain vantage points, but are very visible from others. So I was wondering if you could talk more about this idea of speakability and those silences and shadows relative to different vantage points.
Yeah, it is an idea that I'm still working with, the issue of silence, secret but not secret, And it's not that it's uniformly unspeakable. As I said, for instance, in Najmabadi family, within their own household, everybody had spoken to everybody. I was an outsider, so the first reaction was, how did you know? But I was the one who was not supposed to know because it wasn't supposed to be spoken outside the family. So unspeakability always has a place and time. And then slowly they started telling me things, and slowly I became part of the people for whom they could speak, and in fact tell me off if I thought one of the relatives was not as worthy as the other ones, or I spoke using vocabulary that may have meant that. So yes, I mean, I am struggling to how I sort of work with this concept that located, not just as if it's uniformly unspeakable. And I'm interested in how, what are the spaces in which it's okay to speak, and spaces in which it's not okay, even for large, complicated families like that. And the way sometimes you get from intonation, from the structure of the sentence, that something is not quite it. So I was, one of the families that, again, I worked with, and their family documents involves a very aristocratic family, very well-known aristocratic family, whose son first marries a cousin, but his mother was very much against that marriage. So eventually he divorces her, she gets married and goes off. They have one son, and then after he marries another wife, and from whom he has several children, I was reading the autobiography of one of the sons from the second marriage, and it was literally somewhere like 200 pages into the book. He's about 14 years old. He's talking about one afternoon how his father's secretary came and told him to come because his father wants to see him. He enters, does his respectful greetings, and there's another young man there in his 20s, and the father turns to him and says, "This is your brother." And so he writes about this brother that I did not know exists, and nobody within the family talked about it, even though in the archive I told you about, we have letters from the first wife's mother talking about the relationship and how it was ending in divorce. So it obviously was talked in letters that even were written by someone to another one, but this particular, the offspring of the second marriage, they didn't know about one other son from the first. So I'm trying to localize it. I'm trying to see how this happened. But I also want to do how I don't know, although this particular person I've interviewed also. What did it feel like to find at the age of 14 you have another brother looking at you? And how are you supposed to relate to this person as a brother? How does the affect of brotherhood now at this age is going to develop between you? So, I don't have an easy answer for you, but I'm just trying to sort of do a lot of micro stories. I may just write, 100 little vignettes of stories, who knows?
I think we can do one last question here.
Thank you so much for a really, really fascinating talk. I'm interested, and maybe this is a question that builds off the last two, about sources and what they say about their particular spaces the sources are coming from. When we look at studies of marriage over, the 19th and 20th century, there's a lot of reference to these photographs, wedding photographs, dress, things that happen within the household. But there's things that are meant sort of for public display or sort of public performance. What I'm curious about is, you're getting these stories that are also coming out of the household, or these things that were unspeakable but spoken within the household, or known within a sort of circumscribed set of community. How can we get to the way that these unspeakable shadow relationships were displayed in public in the way the conjugal marriage was, because part of this whole thing was not just like we're going to have a conjugal marriage because we're going to do that by having a wedding photograph. It was we're going to go out in public together, and we're going to sit next to each other in the movie theater, and we're going to sit next to each other on the bus or the train. And you mentioned, the story about the grandmother going out where it becomes like this tricky public interaction. And what kind of sources can we kind of go to maybe we don't usually use to talk about marriage, to talk about these other sorts of relationships?
Yeah. Sources for doing private life history is always a big issue. This digital archive I started in 2008, 2009 in part was motivated because people who do 19th century Iranian history continuously tell you there are no sources for doing this, or there are no sources for doing that. And it turns out it's not a question of there are no sources, but the sources are inaccessible. And the question was how to make it accessible, because the sources are sitting, in fact, in people's living rooms, in boxes that are rotting to dust in their basements because they've been sitting there forever and nobody touched them. I spend with a whole lot of wonderful people going house to house and digging these things, digitizing them and putting them online. So actually, at least for my own work, I invented an archive, I fabricated an archive. So they range, it's limited what's in the letters, what's in the photographs, what's in the marriage contracts, what's in the inheritance documents. It's hard to access affect through those, because those are just these things. So that's why I'm also doing a lot of oral history interviews it's the time frame I'm working. There are now people in their 90s who were there. So I'm trying to reach these people before they disappear. It's a very terrible utilitarian approach, and it beats me up. But the minute I hear, so-and-so is 97 years old in this village near Tabriz, there I go. But that's what I'm trying to do, a combination of ethnography, oral history, interviews, and then see, once I have those, how I actually see the photographs differently than I did before, how I read the letters and the affect that comes through letters especially differently than I had read. So I keep rereading everything and looking at the photographs again. And of course, at the end of the day, it's going to be my fiction. Because who knows if really people felt this or not, but if you're in history, that's what we